Good evening and welcome to the Job Search Solution, the radio program where we talk about looking for a job, changing jobs, changing careers, hiring. And as always, we begin with a prayer. Dear God, grant us thy peace and thy mercy, thy will be done. And I wanted to speak about in this session, we're continuing with myths of the job market and myths of getting a job. And the two myths that I wanted to discuss today briefly are, first of all, that interviewing is a two-way street. And secondly, the best candidate always gets hired. Interviewing is not a two-way street. Most candidates think, well, I sell myself and then they sell me their job and we eventually come together. It's a two-way street. No. Interviewing is a one-way street until you get to, metaphorically, the altar. Once you have gotten metaphorically to the altar and you're ready to exchange nuptials, then it can become a two-way street. It can become, they've got to sell you as much as you have had to sell them. But until then, it's you and at least 10 other candidates that are trying to get the same job. It is a one-way street. And whether you like it or not, the employer sees it that way. And the authority, get that, the implication of the hiring authority believes that he's the one, he or she is the one with the job, and therefore it's their way or the highway. Now, what this means is that you've got to be selling yourself all of the time until you get to ready to take a job. Then you can get them to sell you as much as you need. But until then, don't even dream of it. I had a candidate tell me yesterday on an initial interview, well, this interviewing is a two-way street. I said, where'd you get that idea? He said, well, all kinds of articles on the internet say that, you know, it needs to be a mutual discussion and a mutual exchange of here's what I can do for you and here's what you can do for me and all of that. And that's a lot of junk. That's not true. That employer is interviewing at least 4 or 5, maybe 10 other candidates that are giving them plenty of good reasons of why they ought to be hired. And then the employer is going to sell that job to the prospective candidate. So don't think that interviewing is a two-way street, because it's not. It's a one-way street until you, like I say, metaphorically get to the altar. And the second myth is the best candidate always gets hired. You know as well as I do that's not true. Look at some of the people you've either worked for or you've worked with that really didn't turn out to be anywhere near what everybody expected them to be when they were interviewing. The best candidate doesn't always get hired, but the candidate that sells themselves the best is the candidate that gets hired. Now, most of the time, candidates that get hired are people that can do the job. You're not going to see very many accountants that get hired to sell, or very many engineers that get hired to be an accountant. So most of the time, they're going to have some experience, knowledge, and background in what they do, in what they're hired to do. But it's the candidate that sells themselves the best. It's the candidate that gives the hiring authority features, advantages, and benefits as to why they ought to get hired and what they can do for the company that nobody else can. This is really important to remember, that it's the candidate's job to sell themselves as to why they are the best candidate, what they've done in the past to be able to predict what they'll be able to do for the hiring authority in the future. And this takes a lot of practice. Most candidates think, well, everybody can see that I'm a good candidate. I mean, come on, just look at my resume. Sometimes your resume gets looked at, and sometimes it gets scanned. Most of the time it gets scanned. And you have to be able to go in and be able to say to the hiring authority, Here's where I have been a good employee before, and here is where I'm going to therefore be a good employee for you. We often say here all of the time, or we often say that stories sell and numbers tell. If you can quantify your success for a prospective employer in some of the things you've done before, that is good. People like to hear percentages, numbers, statistics. Saying I'm a good employee without being able to prove it doesn't get you very far. Numbers sell, stories tell. You got to have good stories. Everybody loves a story. We're going to talk about that in subsequent sessions, but you got to have good stories as to why and how you've been a good employee. You only need 2 or 3 really good stories. They don't need to be long, 45 seconds, maybe a minute at the most, but you need to be able to explain, I'm a good employee because here are some of the things that I've done, and tell stories about your successes, everywhere from college all the way through your career. Stories sell and numbers tell. If you can do that and you can tell good stories about your experience and background, proving that you are a good employee, that's the most important thing you can do. It's not hard if you get the idea that it's whoever sells themselves the best is usually the candidate that is going to get hired. And you sell yourself with stories and you sell yourself with numbers. All right, we're going to take a short break. Stay tuned. This is Tony Bashara with the Job Search Solution.